Bryan Seip, president of the Montour Railroad Historical Society and a volunteer at the Dare Model Railroad Club. The Montour Railroad operated through Peters Township for 66 years, and when railroad operations ended, the township bought the right-of-way and converted it to a multi-use recreational trail. We're going to show you a presentation done at the Peters Township Public Library that gives a virtual tour and a history of the Montour Railroad in Peters Township.
Montour Railroad in Peters Township. So a little background history. Montour Railroad was organized in 1887 and began operations hauling coal in 1889. But its history in Peters Township didn't start until 1913. Now this picture is, you might have seen this upstairs, this picture is from the 1920s or 30s and it shows a coal train eastbound through the township. This picture is taking, you're standing on the hill above Thomas Road looking north. So this is Thomas Road here. This is Valley Brook Road coming down here. Or I'm sorry, McMurray Road. Valley Brook Road is on the other side of the railroad, back in this section. And over in right here is where the Dairy Bar Heisler Market, that is, the McMurray underpass would have been right here. So this is, as you can see, not much development in Peters Township in that particular days. In 1913 and 14, Montour took on a massive building project to extend the railroad 34 miles from Imperial to West Mifflin. At that point, it was only 10 miles long from Coriopolis up to Imperial. So they added 34 miles to reach other railroads that they could interchange with in West Mifflin. This opened service to several new coal mines along this route, including Montour No. 4 in Peters Township. Montour 4 was the most prolific coal producer on the Montour. Many days at No. 4 saw over 100 cars loaded with coal. It took 3 or 4 full trains to ship coal out of the mine. Montour 4 was one of the busiest places on the railroad. They shipped coal for 66 years, and it only ended when a catastrophic flooding of the mine caused a sudden closure in August of 1980. They punched through into another old mine that was filled with water. They filled the mine up with water, and they couldn't keep up with the pumps. They determined that there were only, depending who you talk to, supposedly only 5 or 6 years of coal left in Montour 4, so they decided that it wasn't worth the cost to try and reopen it, and they shut it down. So the mine was abandoned, and they had concrete pumped in to permanently seal the shaft. Now the railroad continued operations through the township until the end of 1980. This was the last train, December 26th, heading to Brookside Lumber in Bethel Park to pick up some empty cars. The railroad in Peters was then abandoned. The township purchased the 100 acres of railroad within the township in 1985. With the help of state funds, the first phase was developed as a recreational multi-use trail, as well as to preserve and reinstate the natural surroundings with native trees and wildflowers. This was the first section of the railroad to be repurposed as a hiking and biking trail. It was named the Arrowhead Trail by the township. When the Montour Trail Council was formed 4 years later, an agreement was made with the township to include the Arrowhead portion as a part of the larger Montour Trail system. With the aid of a grant, the original section of the Arrowhead Trail was resurfaced in 2002. The Arrowhead Trail paved section runs 3.5 to 4 miles from Route 19 to Brush Run Road, and it's maintained by the township. The other 3 non-paved sections are maintained under a working agreement with the Montour Trail Council, and the entire trail surface in Peters is part of the Montour Trail system. So now we can start our little tour. The railroad was basically constructed from west to east, so we'll take that same route. The railroad entered Peters Township over the Chartiers Creek Bridge. 270 feet in length, it's the 3rd longest bridge on the Montour. The McDonald Viaduct and the Library Viaducts are longer than this bridge. It's made up of 3 spans of 90 feet each, sitting on concrete piers, and it had a wooden deck to hold the rails. After sitting idle for over 25 years, in 2008, the Montour Trail Council had a concrete deck poured on the bridge to carry traffic into the newly opened section of the trail in Peters Township. Coming off the bridge, you immediately enter Greer's Tunnel, going through the ridge carrying Hidden Valley Road. At 235 feet, it's the shortest of the 4 tunnels that were bored on the Montour. When it was built in 1913, its portals and liner were made of wood. In 1922, concrete portals and liner were added. So thus, the date stamped in the concrete at the entrances reads 1922, although at that time the tunnel was actually 9 years old. Exiting the tunnel, you cross a steel through-truss bridge over another railroad. Through-truss such called because, as you can see, it makes a box fare with this ironwork. The train passes through the bridge. The railroad it crosses over was built before the Montour, and it goes through the ridge and over Chartiers Creek on its own tunnel and bridge. It's still active, and it's operated by the Pittsburgh and Ohio Central Railroad. The Montour Railroad ran along the hillside as it wound along the edge of the Chartiers Creek Valley, and after about a half mile, a few hundred yards before a road crossing, you pass mile marker 31. This is one of the original markers set by the railroad when it was constructed. This was done over a century ago, and it's notable by the white number on the black plate and post. It measured the distance from the Montour connection with the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad in Coriopolis. A few hundred yards away is the Montour Trail milepost. They don't match up with the Montour Railroad markers because they use a different starting point, and some realignments that were done in the right-of-way for the railroad changed the actual distance. So it shortened up the railroad a bit, but the original mileposts were never reset and never changed. After crossing Buckeye Street, the railroad continued along the hillside toward Valley Brook Road. And this section of the trail remains much as it was during the life of the railroad, and as you can see, with no development along this section. If you approach Valley Brook Road, you pass through Camp's Cut, named after the family which owned the land when the railroad was constructed. The cut is curved, and the train engineers could not see a nearby switch heading into the mine on the other side of Valley Brook Road. So thus signal lights were mounted on 2 poles to show the engineer whether the switch was set for the main track, as this green signal shows, or diverging into the mine yard, as indicated by a red signal. When these were set up, this was before radio communications, and the engineer had to rely on visual signals from the brakeman and the conductor and to how to, when and where to stop the train. So if he couldn't see around the curve, then he had to have a way to figure out which way this switch was set. And he could watch the lights, and he would see if it changed from green to red, then he would know that the conductor had thrown the switch and he could advance into the mine. Railroad then crossed over Valley Brook Road as it entered the site of Montour Mine number 4. Part of this bridge is still in use, this span right here that goes over Brush Run Creek. This span was removed because it was too low and trucks, several trucks lost their tops going through there. And then it was replaced with a steel bridge. Further down, yes. In Cecil, I might add, yes. Just off that bridge, over Valley Brook, was the railroad switch for the loaded yard of number 4. And this was the switch that was connected to the signals in Camp's Cut. So if the train went, quote, straight, it goes around this bend up here, obviously, but that was the main line. If it went into the yard, you can see this is loaded hopper cars of coal. waiting to be picked up and taken away. And during the winter weather, track gangs would be tasked with keeping the switches clear of snow and ice to prevent derailments. The snow and ice would pack up between the rails, and when you threw the switch, sometimes it wouldn't close all the way. And just like closing your garage door. And if it didn't close all the way, you ended up with a train on the ground. Further down, as you round the curve, a phone booth stood beside the main line. This gave the train crews communications with the dispatcher at Montour Junction. It was used until radios came into being in the early 1970s. Phone booths were at locations where the trains would be working onto or off of the main line, and it allowed the train's conductor to obtain permission from the dispatcher to occupy a section of the main line, protecting it from other trains on the single track. There were close to 50 phone booths over the length of the Montour, and they were all networked down to the dispatcher in Coriopolis, is where the offices were. It had the old magneto, crank the phone, ring the bell type of things, and you would crank it up and it would ring at the other end, and the dispatcher would pick it up and the conductor would be able to talk to him. On the hillside, opposite about where that phone booth was, there's footings for a water tank that was used to supply steam locomotives. It's up on the edge of the bank. There's a picnic table there and an informational sign, so you can find it. Here's a picture of the sign and up on the hillside behind. And rather than a traditional spout on a tank like you see in most pictures, this was a wooden tank, but it fed a water column that was located beside the main tracks. Along that hillside, there are remnants of another right-of-way. And this was the track that was known as Hill's Transfer. Loaded and empty cars of coal and other freight were exchanged between the Montour and the Pennsylvania railroads. Where it ran beside the Montour main line, it was one track. Here's the main line with some empty cars sitting on it. Here's the transfer track. As you can see, these are non-coal. The tank car, a gondola, box car, these could have been going to other industries along the Montour. These tracks over here, this is the loaded yard, as you can see, with the loaded cars coming out of Montour number 4. Further down along the hillside, as it diverged away from the main line, it became 2 tracks so that they could store more cars and bring cars in and out. It met the Pennsylvania Railroad near the edge of the current Frosty Valley golf course. The Montour switch was located near the spot where the caboose and X1 crane now sit. This tipple building is where the red brick garage of Tom Robinson sits. The other building across from it is this building here, it's the hoist house. And right about, and this is here's the switch, right about where these cars are sitting is where the crane and the caboose are now located. The tipple building and the shaft for Montour 4 were sited at this spot. The building nearest the creek, this one, is still there. And that was the original hoist house for the mine. And a vertical shaft was dug next to it, served by this elevator. And the mine opened in 1914. The large tipple building was built to receive coal from the mine, sort it, clean it, and load it into rail cars. That lasted until 1953, when a new shaft, portal, and tipple were built, and this was used until the mine was closed in 1980. So here's the original shaft, the hoist house. This was a aerial tramway that ran up onto the hillside over here to dump slate and impurities. So here's the new tipple over the tracks. This is the main line, now the trail, and the conveyor belt went over to the hillside over here and then sloped down at an angle down to the mine below. As you go around the next curve, the open area was the empty yard. And several tracks could hold empty hoppers awaiting loading at the tipple. Notice that the empty yard and the loaded yard on the far side of the tipple ran at a gentle slope. So when you walk along the trail, you can see that it slowly has a little bit of a slope to it. This was designed so that the hopper cars could be moved by gravity into and then beyond the loading tipple, and thus no locomotives would be needed when they were loading the coal from the mines. Locomotives were only needed to deliver the cars and to take them away. The switch to access the empty yard was located just before the next bridge, which crossed over Valley Brook Road. Here's the switch stand. The switch was just off the bridge. This is now a trail bridge over Valley Brook Road. For the trail people that know this is one called VB2. Here's the head of a line of empty cars. They're sitting in the empty yard. When the railroad was built, Valley Brook was just a dirt road. It was paved later, and then after the railroad was abandoned, realigned again in the 1980s to give it its current configuration. So after you cross Valley Brook Road, the railroad entered a short cut in the hillside and crossed yet another bridge over Brush Run. Here's the bridge over Brush Run. This is Route 19 up here. And down in behind this hillside is where the sanitation plant is now located. This bridge was built before the sanitation plant existed, and the concrete abutment for the bridge can still be seen near the top of the current trail bridge. This is the steel trail bridge that comes out of the parking lot. Here's the concrete abutment, and when you look at the bridge, that's the same abutment on this side. Here's the sanitation plant just as it was being built when the bridge was being removed. Now this parking lot here is where the paved portion known as the Arrowhead Trail picks up, and it runs through the township. Another crossing of the creek is made at the far west end of the now St. Petersburg Center parking area. So this is from the other side. Here's again is Route 19. This is Route 19 up here from the Cecil side, if you will. This is where the paved passing storage siding known as Thompsonville siding was added at this point. The railroad was double tracked for the next half mile. So extra cars going to or from number 4 would not fit into the mine yards, could be stored here until space opened up at the mine, or they were picked up by another train and taken away. So this is from the St. Petersburg Center side. Again, this bridge is still here with the trail, Route 19. This is Valley Brook Road along here. This is the old Valley Brook Road ramp coming down from Route 19. And this overhead bridge was the Pittsburgh Railway's interurban trolley line that ran from Pittsburgh to Canonsburg and then all the way down to Washington. And it was in existence. That rail line, the trolley line, operated until 1953. So that dates this picture as a little bit before 53. Now if you go a little further down, if you use the trail at the Pelopets Road access, you note that the bridge there is 2 tracks wide. So that's the other end of this Thompsonville siding. The track nearest the hillside was the main line. The track nearest the creek was the Thompsonville siding. A few hundred yards east of that bridge was the end of the siding, and the Montour became 1 track again. A little further down on the south side of the trail, there are some concrete footings found along the trail's edge. This is the access trail that's going up into the new Rolling Hills Park up on the hillside, but here's footers, central column post. Here's 2 other footers for the Fife water tank. It was a large steel tank, and around 1917, plans were made to establish a locomotive servicing facility at this point. The nearest facilities were at Montour Junction, which was over 30 miles away, or at Mifflin Junction, which was 15 miles to the east. Those plans never came to fruition, and the Fife tank was eventually dismantled. Next along the line was the infamous, at least to Montour railroaders, turkey farm. It was located across the creek from the current Washington Federal Savings Bank. It's now an empty lot, but you may recall a house and buildings on that site up until several years ago, until they were torn down. So this scene shows a coal hopper which derailed and rolled onto its side, spilling its load along the hillside. Driveway came up from the current Brush Run veterinary lot, it's still there, and crossed the railroad. So that was a convenient access point for railroad crews working with high rail maintenance vehicles to set onto or off of the tracks. This scene shows a track gang posing for a picture as they were replacing ties in the area in the late 1970s. Everything was done by hand on the Montour. This scene shows a weed sprayer truck that had been working along the railroad. After leaving the rails to fill up with water, the driver missed the rails when trying to set back on a turkey farm, and he almost rolled the truck into the ditch. Hard to see, but there's some chains here and here that are fastened to the truck and to the rails to keep it from rolling over further and going down into the ditch. And P.S., the two guys in the picture are Montour employees who were on the job, but neither one of them were the driver. A high rail crane had to be dispatched, and it was seen crossing Valley Brook Road on its way to clear up the incident. So they couldn't just pull it up. Those of you that watch Highway Through Hell and Rescue 401 and some of those shows, they had to bring in the big guy. Oh my, yeah, a rotator, exactly. Then the railroad crossed over McMurray Road on a short steel bridge. The roadway under the bridge was only 24 feet wide, 2-lane. When the intersection was reconfigured, a new concrete bridge 110 feet long replaced the original bridge. The railroad also serviced McMurray Supply, which was a lumber supply and home coal delivery business. It had its own spur tracks that went off the main line here. The Cobb Collection and the office buildings next door, when you go down Valley Brook Road, was originally the McMurray Supply. Next point of interest as we proceed down Valley Brook Road is the big brick farmhouse near the Bebop Road intersection. This house was not built by the railroad, but it was bought in the 19-teens to house the foreman of the section track gang. Across from this house, concrete slab still exists where a tool house was located. Similar to this one, tool house, in fact, this is an ex-Montour tool shed. It's over at the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Ohio right now. Similar to this tool house, it held track tools and supplies such as spikes, tie plates, joiner bars, and other items that were needed. And it also housed a speeder car that was used by the track section crews. The railroad crossed Bebop Road over a concrete arch bridge. This narrow and low underpass prevented large trucks from using the road. And in 2012, so that's actually 10 years ago now, wow, it was demolished and replaced with a 144-foot steel beam bridge. Montour ran further through the township along the edge of what became Peters Woods Park until it crossed Sugar Camp Road. This was another concrete arch bridge with limited clearances. It was also raised and replaced by a longer concrete bridge in 2012. These were township projects, and this section of the trail is part of the township maintained Arrowhead Trail. Montour's original main line ran through the Milton Douglas Farm, which is now the Emperor's Arabian Horse Farm, and into a cut crossing under Brush Run Road. When the railroad was built in 1913, a steel bridge with a wooden plank deck carried Brush Run Road over the railroad. After the railroad was abandoned, The aging bridge was taken out, and the cut was filled in up to the road level. So thus the trail now goes up an earthen ramp on one side, crosses the road, and then goes back down the ramp on the other side to the original railroad level. So there's your answer for the Brush Run
You
Bridge.
can tell it's too steep for the train.
Yeah. The right-of-way traveled along the hillside toward McMurray Road along what the railroaders called Rocky Ridge. And this was empty farmland through most of the life of the railroad. But now this picture is basically taken from McMurray Road looking across. Now that entire valley is filled with houses. And this was the original main line of the Montour Railroad. And thus the railroad milepost 37 is evident as it left Peters Township and crossed into Bethel Park. So what is the Bethel Park branch of the trail was actually the main line of the Montour Railroad. The Montour ran through Bethel Park to a connection with other railroads in West Mifflin at Mifflin Junction. So now let's back up a little bit, actually move forward on the construction timeline. And the previously mentioned Milton Douglas Farm along Sugar Camp Road, a new branch was constructed in 1918, went 2 miles down the hill into South Park Township and accessed the then new Montour No. 10 mine and library. A Y track arrangement was built at the new library junction. This allowed trains to or from No. 10 to go in either direction, east or westbound. So as you can see, the directions marked here. A Y is basically a triangle, or it's like a Y with a slash across the top, if you want to look at it that way. Trains to or from the library mine could come up. If they were being sent to Champion for cleaning, they could go west out through Cecil Township and go out to Champion at Imperial. If they were going to West Mifflin and being shipped that way, they could go up the other lane. The east led to Mifflin Junction, deliveries to and from the Union Railroad. And then the Union Railroad at that point also connected with the Bessemer and Lake Erie. So a lot of Montour coal ended up on the Bessemer and Lake Erie, going up to shipping ports on Lake Erie, and it went overseas. West led to Montour No. 4 mine, further through Cecil, and then on to Champion cleaning plant near Imperial. Siding was added to the library junction to temporarily store hopper cars coming to or from Montour mine No. 10. And due to the steep hill and the sharp curves on the library branch, often the trains, especially the loaded ones, would have to what they call double or even triple the hill. They could bring only some of their loads up in one trip and then would have to go back for the remaining cars. This siding ran from the original main line along the east leg of the Y behind the horse farm to near the Churchill Road Bridge. On the other side of the Churchill Road was the short Gaffney Spur, which allowed the Montour to deliver supplies to a couple businesses at the site of the current bus and construction companies. Halfway down the hill toward Library, Montour crossed into a small slice of Bethel Park and then into South Park Township. The Library branch was later extended through South Park to a connection with the B&O Railroad at Snowden. This is the Montour coming from down the Piney Fork Valley, and this is a double-track B&O railroad that it connected with there. Then extending even further past that area along the former Pennsylvania Railroad Peters Creek branch, the route is now used by the Montour Trail as its main route to connect with the Great Allegheny Passage Trail in Clairton. So that's kind of the end of the tour in Peters, except for one other location that's not on the actual railroad, and this is the Montour History Room. We have a display up here you can take a look at and later and see, gives you an idea of what we have over there. This has memorabilia and artifacts on display. We're located in the Venetia Community Center. The History Room is open whenever the Dare Model Railroad Club is in session, which is currently Wednesday afternoons from 3 to 6 and Saturday mornings. So stop by and check it out, along with the Dare Model Railroad Club's layouts as well. We have a big layout that emulates the Montour Railroad there, as well as we have four classrooms full of model railroads.
When did they convert from steam to diesel engines? Probably a gradual process.
Took several years. First diesels were basically 1949 and 50, and they bought 3 of them. And then over the next 2 years, they bought 9 more. They ended up with 12. Steam was phased out. It was still in use a little bit into the early 50s. The last steam was done in 1952.